Hello everyone. This video today we're going to be talking about separation part 2, and part 2 is going to be a lot more exploratory. So in these parts, really encourage your students to go in a direction that they find interesting and ask them sort of really open-ended questions. So the first exploration that we have is called more company. And the question is what happens if we include an additional shape in our simulation, right? So before we only had triangles and squares, and we had rules about when they were happy depending on what their neighbors looked like. But now what happens if we add a third shape, and we have a rule about when they're happy? Do we get something different? Do we not? Let's see. So we'll still be working on a square grid for this. And you're going to want to let your students decide what sort of happiness rule they want to use. So, for example, maybe you could do at least 50% of my neighbors are like me, or at least 70% of my neighbors are like me, and it doesn't have to be in percentages. You could also use a fraction. You could say at least maybe I'll just put 1/3 of my neighbors are like me, right? Just why not? And then try to predict what happens with these three shapes now, right? So maybe if I have 1/3 of my neighbors are like me, maybe it'll be about the same as what happened last time. But if I instead put 2/3, I think we're going to see like clustering things. I don't know. That's just my guess. But encourage your students to try to predict maybe a little bit what will happen depending on the decisions they've made. So why don't we go ahead and try this out? So if I say 1/3 of my neighbors are like me, well, maybe I'll put some squares in here, like that maybe. And maybe I'll throw some triangles in there. That triangle, already not happy. There's no neighbors like him, so I need a neighbor for this triangle. Maybe I'll put one there. This triangle does now have 1/3 of the neighbors like me, so we're happy. Maybe I can throw some hearts in here too. Maybe like that. Maybe I'll do another one here. And you can just fill it in and double check and make sure that every time you do this, you still end up with someone that is happy, or where everyone is happy. So I just kind of filled these in. I think everyone is happy. I haven't checked them all. But play around with it and see what sort of patterns you get. So this one looks pretty mixed. And ask yourself maybe what happens if I change my 1/3 into a 2/3. Maybe something else happens, right? So you really want to encourage your students to explore this and do what they want, right? So encourage them to pick a parameter and change it if they want to see what happens if they do some other behavior, right? The next separation exploration that we're going to want to do is an absolute rule. So now instead of using percentages and fractions about how our neighbors look like, we're going to use the rule, I'm happy when I have 2 or more neighbors that are like me. And so here, this one is a little less open-ended, but you still want to ask students to try to predict what do we think is going to happen. Are we going to see some mixing? Are they going to group up together? What sort of shapes do we expect to see? And also, how is this different from before? How has this changed? I mean, the rule's different, but what scenarios where would the shapes be happy in the previous rules versus not happy in this one, and vice versa, right? So for example, maybe I can start filling in my triangles and squares here. So if I put a triangle here and maybe a second triangle, I think under a lot of the old rules where it's I'm happy when 20% or 30% or 50% of my neighbors are like me, these two triangles would be super happy. But these two right now are not, because they only have one neighbor like them, which is not 2 or more. So I would need to add a third triangle, and now all 3 triangles are happy, right? And we can keep doing this. Maybe we should add some squares in here. So maybe we'll put a square here, not happy yet, a square here, not happy yet. Now they're happy. So it looks like they need to be at least in clusters of 3. That's interesting, right? So maybe I'll put a triangle there, maybe square there, and you can keep going, right? So interesting. I didn't predict that maybe we would need clusters of 3. But again, you can change this number. So you can say, I'm happy when I have 3 or more neighbors that are like me. Or I'm happy when I have 2 or more neighbors that are not like me, right? And just, you can ask those different questions and you might get very different behavior, and who knows? Try to predict it and see what happens. Fill in a grid.